Midwife Annie Johnson has delivered hundreds of babies over the years, but it's not every day she gets a visit from one of those children.
I go out to the waiting room, and there is this 5-year-old boy in a pink tutu, and his mom comes up to me and is like, he has been waiting to meet you forever. Like, I want to meet the person who was there when I was born.
Aww. After greeting the tutu-adorned 5-year-old, Annie's eyes caught hold of their sibling.
His sister is there and introduces herself to me, and I was like, I remember your birth, which is crazy because I meet people all the time who are like, you changed my life. And I'm like, I don't know who this is. But I had this like crazy flashback because his sister was 2 when he was born, and his parents really wanted her to be at the birth. And I was like,
Midwives deal with some interesting requests through the birthing experience, but having a 2-year-old run around at the birth, well, that seemed like a liability. But Annie agreed, and what she thought might be chaos with the sister turned into something completely different.
She had been asleep in the waiting room, and when it was time for the baby to come, they woke her up, and here comes this like little tiny 2-year-old with these huge blue eyes, and she was just right there and completely transfixed and was just talking to him after he was born and singing him a little song, and she wanted to see the placenta.
Annie was mesmerized by this little girl's shared fascination with birth. To see your world through a child's perspective would forever enshrine this moment in her memory.
And when she came back, I immediately recognized her face.
Yeah.
I was like, I could never forget this birth.
Oh. Welcome to Black Care Matters, the show where we honor the unique experiences of Black nurses working in the Pacific Northwest. I'm your host, Rashida Quinn. In recognizing that Black lives matter, it's crucial that the care for these nurses also matters. Cultural white supremacy has had a detrimental impact on the American healthcare system. Each nurse's story reveals rich insights towards the possibilities of a better future. Today, we welcome Midwife Annie Johnson to the KBOO Studios. Our conversation takes us on an adventure, honestly exploring how she navigated going from the playgrounds of Berkeley, California, to the white walls of the Ivy Leagues. The whole time being sure to be true to herself in order to find her people. It's a jam-packed episode full of equal parts laughter and whimsy, only on Black Care Matters. How do you cultivate your personal Black joy?
You know, it's interesting because I think since we had the first conversation about this, I've been trying to do more things to bring me joy. Like, I was so depressed after our first conversation. I was like, don't do anything for myself. And I was like, okay, this has to change.
That's good. I'm glad to inspire more joy. There's been a lot of talk about switching from terms of self-care to community care because self-care has experienced a sort of marketing phenomenon that makes it inaccessible? Or what comes up when you think about that?
Like, I just was thinking about food recently. I have a new student at work. Like, I've had tons of midwifery students. Whenever I get a new student, I'm always just like, food is the most important thing to me. So, like, we're going to do our job. Like, we got to do patient care. That's, like, the primary. But then the other thing is food. Like, we need to make sure we have breakfast and lunch and dinner and snacks. And, like, once we get done with breakfast, I'm going to be like, what are we eating for lunch?
You know, my grandmother would be maybe a woman of not so many words, but we ate well all the time.
I mean, I think to me, like, self-care sounds like an individual thing. So many nurses, like, the way that we show up in the world and the way that I derive joy from being alive is taking care of other people. And so that makes self-care really confusing, right? Because I'm like, what if how I show up in the world and feed myself is by caring for other people, then how do I take care of myself? And I think this week was actually so fun. Like, we just were home all week, and everyone in our street was home all week, and there were 7 little girls putting on snowsuits and then putting on princess dresses and putting on snowsuits and putting on princess dresses. I'm the most happy when, like, our house is totally the hub of the neighborhood.
Yeah, I think the language of community care has become more common, especially in BIPOC spaces. A lot of folks are saying that people around us make a big difference in how we feel cared for.
Yeah.
We also spoke about Ali Wong because we were talking about comedians and how it's really nice to sit back and let someone else make you laugh.
Oh, my God. I feel like my set is all about, like, being a parent.
Yeah.
I have these moments sometimes where I realize, like, as a midwife, one of the gifts that I give to people is to, like, tell them and validate for them how hard it is to be a parent, how often we just, like, have no idea what we're doing. We're, like, fumbling through. We're, like, sometimes, like, hating our children. These moments that, like, people just think they're not allowed. I had this woman who came in recently who was just crying because she was like, I didn't automatically love my baby. Like, when he was born, I just didn't automatically love him. People have so much guilt around this, right? She was just like, I'm supposed to automatically love this person. And I was like, why? You just met them.
Yeah.
Right? Like, they just came out. You don't know who they are. It was, like, a lot of trouble to get them. And then they wake you up every 2 hours and scream at you a lot and bite your boob. Like, it's not like an automatic recipe for love, right?
Totally.
Like, it's okay if you don't automatically love them. It might take a little while. You're gonna get to the point where you love them. It's coming. It's like, okay if it's not instantaneous.
Well, you know, we're going to talk about Kamau Bell a little bit in a second, and we talk about Berkeley. But in one of his stand-ups, he talks about how his daughter, his 3-year-old, will just sock him like as hard as she can.
Yep.
And his whole joke is like, okay, like, let's play this out. Like, let's say you hit me and I fall over and faint. What happens next for you? What are you having for lunch? Like,
no one's going to help you now.
It's just like so accurate, like these moments. I love that.
3-year-olds, no future planning.
Totally. You don't have to be in love with someone you just met.
Oops, mom's dead. Now what?
So you grew up in Berkeley, California. When I think of Berkeley, I think like crunchy granola. Portland with more people of color. Better weather. Kamau Bell, he's from Berkeley, and he describes how you might see someone walking down the street butt naked, and that would be normal. So I'm curious, like, how would you describe Berkeley to an outsider?
That you just brought up naked people, because across the street from my elementary school was this 60-year-old, like, paraplegic man in a wheelchair, and he had these 3 women who were his caretakers that were also sort of like his harem that never wear shirts ever. They just boobs out all the time. These, like, 3 ladies, and they would, like, push him around in his wheelchair and, like, help him up and down the stairs. And this is directly across the street from our elementary school. So every single day would just be, like, the naked ladies, and they're, like, old man in the wheelchair, and then all the kids would just, like, run to the fence and be like, the naked ladies!
Oh my God.
This is just Berkeley.
Well, there you go, outsiders.
That's it. When I was growing up, I lived in, like, a really bad neighborhood in Berkeley, which is that's not really a thing anymore. When I was little, I was allowed to ride my bike up and down the street, but not around the street, because the next street up was the crack street. Our house got broken into like 10 times. Like, I walked into a robber in our house. When I was little, we didn't have a TV because it just kept getting stolen. All different kinds of people.
And what was community like, you know, as a kid, a biracial kid, your relationships, your friendships, being raised by your mom, who's white and single? How did that experience shape you?
I mean, I think my mom was always really into communal living. Like, she lived in a bunch of different, like, intentional communities before I was born. We lived in a garage that was behind a big house where a whole bunch of other families lived. And so that was just kind of the norm for me. A lot of those people were, like, either, like, queer or, like, kind of alternative, or, like, a lot of single moms and kids and not a lot of dads. And that was just kind of normal. And I think some of that was like necessity, right? Because when you don't have a lot of money, you just have to figure out how to make it work. But I think some of that was also just like intentional on her part, because she was like, it's just me and you.
Right. So as a young person entering into adulthood, did you have any inkling or thoughts about coming into a medical profession?
You know, when I was really into the arts and wanted to be a writer and went to college and was just like, I'm going to experience literature. Like, I not ever was like, oh, I'm going to work in a hospital. Like, that was not on the docket really at all.
Well, it sounds like academic studies was a priority for you if you went to Vassar. What was that experience like?
So weird. I knew I wanted to go to a liberal arts college, and I didn't want to go to a school with requirements, right? Like a lot of the Ivy Leagues, you have to take all these core courses that are like Faust and just like all these old white men. I was like, I don't want to learn that. I just want to be able to control like what classes I take.
Right.
I think that's how I chose schools. But then when I got there, the East Coast is a totally different world, right? Like lots of white people, lots of rich people, but also a different kind of rich people. Because I grew up in Berkeley. I was like, I know about rich people. A lot of rich, naked, pot-smoking Jews. Then I went to the East Coast and I was like, oh my God, this is a totally different kind of rich people that I had no idea existed. Like people who have a mansion on the Upper West Side with like a cook and a driver and a private town car and a helicopter that picks them up.
Next level rich people.
Yeah. Like at Vassar, what I did was make friends with all the scholarship kids. Everyone. It's all the brown kids. It's all the poor kids all sitting together because there aren't even enough black kids to like have their own group of people.
I'm also curious what that meant for your confidence. Did it feel like you were secluded from a rich, more predominantly white majority, or did you just find your way?
I think academically, I came from a huge public high school. Like there were 1,000 people in the class that I graduated in. And in that environment, I was like a very good student. Then you go to a place like Vassar and you're with these kids who've been going to college prep schools since they were born. But I don't know. I think sometimes being in an environment where you feel like people are smarter than you and you are learning from them, it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Right. Yeah. So after college, you were a nanny for some folks in Philly. You've shared that during this time you had very visceral experiences involving birth. Can you share a little bit about what pointed you towards midwifery?
Yeah, so there was this woman that I nannied for. She had a 2-year-old, and she was pregnant, and she introduced me to a lot of things about birth that I didn't really know about. I was just starting to get interested in the birth world, and she like talked to me all about doulas. She had been a doula, and then she was a NICU nurse. She told me about this midwifery conference and like gave me all her old like doula papers and materials, the things that she had used to become a doula. And then she also was pregnant. And then at some point she was like, you should just come to my birth. I'm going to have a home birth. Like you should just come be there. So she called me when she went into labor, and I like immediately got on my bike. It was definitely like very wintry and cold, and just like started riding. I'm like so excited. I like have all the things that I need in my backpack. And then I got a flat tire.
Oh no.
Just left my bike. I was like locked it to a pole and was just like, but I don't care if I never see you again. Bye bike. Like I gotta get to this birth. And I like kept walking till I got to her house.
That seems to be a big part of it, might I add, like the resiliency of the midwife to get there. And maybe I'm basing this off of the show.
No, it's real.
But it seems like there's always this like element of the birth that has to do with getting to the birth, no matter the cost.
So I get there, and I didn't really have a job. You know, I'm like, I'm not the midwife, I'm not the doula. Like, I just was sort of like an observer at this birth. But as it sort of went along, this woman's partner was like really not into anything gross or bloody. You know, he was just sort of like hovering by her head, like patting it It was like he's not really trying to get in there at all. And I was kind of like, that's not really what she needs. And I was like, well, I can rub her back, or I can like hold her hand, or I can like see that she's really hot and sweaty and like bring her a towel that's like cold and wet. Like it just seemed very like clear to me the things that she would need.
Yeah.
And that it came very naturally to like do those things.
Yeah.
And it was amazing. I got to be there for this whole birth. I stayed awake. He was born, I think, at like 5 a.m. And then there was just almost like this buzzing sound. Just this like so much electricity, like in the room, in the house, in the space after this baby came out. And it gets, like it really gets you high. Like it's crazy. And then I remember I left there. I was walking from her house to the other family that I was supposed to nanny for, and like the sun was rising, and I just had this like amazing feeling like this is why you're here. Like this is what you were put on the earth to do.
Oh, it gives me chills. It's like you had a calling, like an actual moment where you and this woman and her baby and the universe collided and collaborated on Annie Johnson, the midwife. It's amazing.
I think for so much of my life, like I don't really fit anywhere. I'm not really white, and I'm like not really black, and I'm not really straight, and like I don't really identify as gay. And then I'm like, there's just all of these boxes, and like none of them really made any sense for me to go into. But I think like being a midwife, that's a thing where I'm like, that just makes sense. Like that's a box that I could be like, oh, I can get inside this box. Like it feels amazing in here. And whenever I meet other midwives, I'm like, those are my people.
So when you did go to midwifery school, that was in Oregon. And what was that experience like for you? I mean, from Berkeley to Vassar, back to the Pacific Northwest, but then with this very direct intention of becoming a midwife at a teaching school. Did you like it? Did it bring all of these experiences that you just shared kind of into focus?
When I decided I wanted to become a midwife, I moved home for a year and a half. And then I also got a job working at Planned Parenthood. So like working in the medical field and going to community college for almost 2 years. I think probably that learning environment like ended up being just as valuable to me in this way that I wasn't necessarily expecting. And that was like, you know, totally in contrast to being at OHSU. I mean, it's basically like a kingdom on the hill overlooking the entire city.
Right.
Like, just
literally.
Geographically. No, totally. Like, when I went to interview there, I remember I like...
Which makes no sense why you would put a hospital at the end of like 25 hairpin turns.
No.
I've always thought that
it doesn't
feels
make
so
any
dangerous.
Sense. I know. So I went to my interview and I wore like a fancy business suit and fancy shoes and like a pea coat, and I took the tram and it was snowing. Like it was snowing when I got to the top, and I just like stood out on the edge of the tram and like the snow, and you can see the whole city and the mountains, and it's so beautiful. And I remember being like, I'm dressed up as somebody else. I have like put on this persona. Like I am now dressed up as like a medical professional. You know, and then I like went to my interview. I always felt on the hill a little bit like I was putting on a persona that like wasn't really who I am. Like just having to perform in some way. And that's how it is when you're new at something, right? When you're a student, you pretend to be the thing until you actually become the thing, and then you don't have to try as hard.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of also normal for students.
How did the reality of it being predominantly white affect your experience or connect with this idea of performance?
I think moving to Oregon in a lot of ways was like going back in time for me, right? After growing up in Berkeley and then living in places like New York and Philly, and then you come to Oregon, and you have to explain to people why it's not okay to touch your hair. Like, just really basic stuff that I was like, it's bonkers that white people here don't know that. Like, we're all going back to square one.
Yeah.
It's not... I just felt like it was like this weird specimen from Africa, and people were like, what is this?
Well, and it's unchecked here, right? There is nothing to rub up against, and everybody's kind of confirming in each other that it's okay.
It's interesting because I think I've spent so much of my life in spaces that are mostly white, and so for me, it's like... maybe it's my first language.
I think that your experience, as you said, maybe your first language had whiteness sort of baked into it, but also it sounds like your natural self was colorful. And so the ways that you play with the dial, you learn to turn it down when you have to. And then when you're not in a space that requires that, how it feels a little bit more loose and you oscillate back and forth.
Yeah.
I want to revisit the trajectory around nursing because I also know that you got to have a really special experience in Mexico as you became a midwife. And I'm curious about that experience.
And I found this program in Mexico. It was a 3-month program, and it was 3 students and 1 midwife. So it was super small, and it was just a couple of us. And it was like a month living in a house all together. We did like Spanish class and cooking class, and then we did like midwife class with this midwife. So we read all these books and learned about like normal physiologic birth and medications for labor and positions to help people be more comfortable and just the very basics of midwifery. And then we did homestays with 3 different traditional healers where we lived in their houses, we worked in their clinics, we like ate dinner with their families. I mean, we just shadowed them and did whatever they did for a whole week.
Wow, incredible.
It was amazing. I mean, nothing like how midwifery is in the U.S., but I think it was really cool to see like normal birth in a setting outside the hospital in a country where people view birth as a normal thing. You know, I still see this often with our first or second generation Hispanic patients that come to the hospital. For them, in their mind, they're like, this is a normal thing that people do, right? Like eating or pooping. You give birth, right? Like, I never met anyone giving birth in Mexico who'd never been to a birth before.
Yeah.
You would have had to live in a vacuum as a recluse in order to have that experience. Like, birth is just a normal part of life, and it's something that happens for a lot of people either at home or at the midwife's house who lives 5 blocks away. So it's also something that's taking place in the space where people are living all the time. And in Mexico, when you have your prenatal visits, you come and for every single person, they would do massage, right? They're like giving you a massage and touching your body. They would do cupping for people. All the midwives were trained in cupping there, so everyone would get cupping. And the other thing is the rebozo. Do you know about this?
Yeah.
It's like that. It's like this big piece of cloth, and they use it to hold up your belly, and then they'll do things like shake your belly back and forth or like shake your hips back and forth. But they would do that to people at every single prenatal visit.
Or you're going to be nurtured in this way that feels like in, you know, connection with the body you're in that's experiencing pregnancy.
Totally. And there aren't a lot of things that we can do to make those things better. So if your prenatal appointment is a time where you get like care and physical touch, like that just makes so much sense to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what I love about this particular conversation of bringing the human to the care of the human is that it connects with the topics we've been discussing in terms of community care. And it connects with the ways in which Black communities aren't necessarily being given an entire academic briefing about the ways that they're caring for people, but that it's intuitive to touch the person that came to the room who's having a baby because their body is going through something extreme and they need hands. birth is quite different in the States. Can you share? Because I think when a lot of people think about midwifery, they think rustic and maybe older women and not enough stuff, like not enough things to have safety. And there is a very distinct reality around being a midwife, a nurse practitioner. So what is the technical definition, and how is that different from an OBGYN that handles birth?
I think it's a little complicated because there are a bunch of different types of midwives. I'm a nurse midwife. I'm a nurse practitioner. So I have a nursing degree, and then I also have a master's in nursing, and then I have a license. And most midwives use the CNM, Certified Nurse Midwife, which is the national certification, which I think makes it confusing to people because most midwives don't write NP on things. But we are nurse practitioners, right? So any midwife that works in a hospital, a nurse midwife, we're all nurse practitioners. So we're just a nurse practitioner that specializes in birth and pregnancy and postpartum and women's health in general.
It's helpful to think about it holistically for those of us that maybe don't know that much about the birthing world and are making decisions about what birth looks like. And so all of these experiences that come together and then influence you. Who are you? What is your specific stamp as a midwife?
It's really just having collaborative care, right? Having somebody who's a good listener, who's going to pay attention to what you're saying, and then address the things that you actually need, because that's what makes people feel cared for, and that's what keeps people coming back, right?
We're finding a way to bring it back. It's something that feels imperative, kind of full circle as you were describing who you are as a midwife.
Yeah. Birth is something that was taking place outside of the hospital in the home.
Right.
Right? And then suddenly it got sucked into this really weird environment where it doesn't belong.
Right. And that was detrimental for a lot of birthing patients. I think about twilight birth and just all the weird shit that happened when white men became the holders of birth because the medical profession needed to monetize this genre of care that was, not traditionally in that space.
Yep.
Yeah.
Insane. And in some ways, being poor or being brown actually was a benefit to people because the first people who gave birth in hospitals were rich white people.
Right.
Right? We were like, those other people, they can keep banging their drums and doing whatever they do in their birthing huts, right?
So it allowed this kind of capsule of how birth happened to maintain itself for a little bit longer.
Yeah.
So you've been practicing for 13 years now. How many babies do you think you've delivered?
478.
You know exactly.
I keep track of them. Yeah.
Wow. That's so awesome.
I want to know when I get to 1,000.
Oh, I love that.
When I very first started, I feel like there were a bunch of midwives who would be like, oh, yeah, I've delivered 1,000 babies. And I don't know if they really kept track, but I was like, I'm right. I have a log. I keep track of every single birth that I do because I'm like, I want to know when I get to 1,000.
Yeah. I can only imagine that there's just so many hugs and joy and gratitude that comes out of a career like that. Well, and my next question was about what's missing from the healthcare system that could drastically reduce the amount of sort of racialized trauma that Black providers and patients experience.
I think sometimes even in our midwifery clinic, we do a much better job of holding space for patients and respecting their differences and protecting them. And then they go into the hospital to have their babies, and it's this huge system that we can't really control what happens there. I feel like a fraud sometimes because I'm trying to convince people or help make people feel safe and tell them it's going to be okay, and then they're just going going into the machine. We can't control how every person in the hospital is going to interact with them.
Right, yeah.
And all it takes is one person.
Right, to send someone over the edge.
You know?
Make it feel
exactly
completely different than it felt when they were cared for.
And once they don't feel safe, right, as a Black person in the hospital, once you have that one interaction with somebody, then you're on edge. Then all the walls come up. Then every single person who comes in the room, you're just like, I don't know who to trust now. Like, I don't know what is real here. I don't know when I'm safe.
It's just such a long lineage of that domino effect.
Totally.
In so many different spheres. And it's so dangerous in the healthcare sphere where you're in, more dire situations, precarious ways that your body needs support. But it exists.
And when you don't
so
trust your
many
healthcare
ways.
provider, then you also get bad care. Like, that's the thing, is it's a self-perpetuating cycle.
We were talking about representation. It goes a long way to feel like there's a connection between you and your provider.
Also, I think racism plays in a lot to how we label patients.
Yes.
Right? Like, you get this patient in labor and her white husband who's 35 and wears his suit into the birth, and he's questioning everything and asking a lot of questions and referencing his lawyer and doing all these things, right? And then that group of people gets labeled as high maintenance, right? We don't want to piss them off.
Right.
We need to cater to their needs, right? When you have a Black patient who comes in and you get that same sort of questioning authority, asking for more information, sort of distrustful of things, that patient gets labeled as disruptive, problem patient. You see these labels that get put in people's chart. And I'm then that affects every single interaction that they have with every single person. Because every person who's going to read that chart is combative patient.
As we wrap up, being a mother, what kinds of things do you hope will change for your children in the future?
I think it's at least exciting to me to imagine a world where we're thinking about a different way to classify people, or just not wanting to do that anymore.
Listening to Annie tell stories has to be one of my favorite things about being in community with her. The vivid way she speaks of her experiences makes the listener feel like you're right there with her while it's happening. I'm so grateful she is a Black provider in Portland. We need more attentive, gregarious, incredibly intelligent providers of color offering care. The story that gave me chills during our conversation together was hearing her share how it felt to attend a birth for the first time. The electricity buzzing in the space, in the moments a new human enters the world, how it felt like a drug and left her knowing this is it. This is what I'm meant to do. What a journey she's had from ditching her broken bike to make it to that birth, to delivering her 478th baby. We ended our conversation by touching on how race impacts patient care. White patients who ask many questions and push providers to be attentive are considered thorough, and Black patients who behave similarly are considered problematic. She shares her hope that one day we won't be classifying people so rigidly anymore. I'm curious about the future as well. On one hand, a distinct culture is what gives humanity variety and excitement. How do we maintain our diversity, but eliminate the type of judgment that happens in hospitals when non-white folks demand quality care? For me, this boils down to the same refrain that we've been singing throughout this entire show. Dismantling systematic cultural white supremacy benefits humanity in the most important ways. Idolizing one culture over the other is not sustainable or healthy for a society. It poisons the colorful way diversity enriches our communities. Every time I sit down with one of these incredible healthcare providers, I walk away more passionately supporting new pathways to liberation for us all. We deserve equality, to be able to pursue our callings uninhibited by racial barriers, and to receive the highest quality of care in our medical system. Thank you, Annie, for sharing your inspiring journey. Join us next time on Black Care Matters. Black Care Matters is presented by the Alliance of Black Nurses Association of Oregon, sponsored by the Oregon Center for Nursing, and was recorded at KBOO Studios here in Portland, Oregon. This episode was produced by Ida Hardin, with production support and mix mastering by Ramoy Phillip. Our executive producer and host, myself, Rashida Quinn. The Black Care Matters podcast website was designed by Brendan Quinn, with portrait art created by Ryan Alexander Tanner. Special thanks to Danae Hall of the Alliance of Black Nurses Association of Oregon, Kelly Castanegro, and our team at KBOO, Jezaniah Hawthorne, Zoe Ezekiels, and Selena Flores. This podcast would not be possible without the generous grant from Oregon Center for Nursing. Thank you to our grant team, Rick Allgeier, Don Schoenthal, and Callie Giesler. And here's a special invite to all of you, our listeners. Please engage with what you hear and learn on Black Care Matters. Did listening to an episode remind you of a racialized experience you had in healthcare? Did it strengthen your commitment to anti-racism in your own workplace or community? Did it bring up questions about how you can better speak out against white supremacy culture? Please reach out with your questions and comments at blackcarematters.org/contact. We would love to feature our listeners' feedback on a special episode of Black Care Matters. Your voice matters. Listen to Black Care Matters wherever you get your podcasts. And while you're there, why don't you leave us a review? Your words really do help us reach a wider audience. It's been a pleasure sharing this with you. We'll have a new conversation for you next month. Until then, remember, Black care does matter. It's a matter of how we make those words count.